Guys, I'm delighted to welcome to the podcast Phillip Patrick. He's a precious metals specialist. He's in fact a spokesman for Birch Gold Group. He was born in London, a degree in politics and international relations from the University of Reading. Spent years as a wealth manager at Citigroup before joining Birch Gold in 2012. By the way, the website for Birch Gold is just birchgold.com, birchgold.com. Phillip, great to have you. Thanks for joining me. Let's talk about our economy. Biden gave a State of the Union address. And, my sense of it was, on the one hand, you've got people who are experiencing a difficult, a bumpy, a rocky economy. And on the other hand, you got a picture from the president that seemed so positive and rosy. There was a disconnect with the way a lot of people feel about it. Give me your kind of brief overview of the speech as a whole, and then I want to hit a couple of the economic highlights in it.
Of course, I had a very similar feeling to you. It was quite predictable. There was a lot of hand waving, a lot of broad generalizations, and of course, appeals for patience. And then he went on to boast about the Biden economy, right? That his fiscally responsible economic growth plan was working. The fact that he's cut the deficit by 1.7 trillion, created more jobs than any other president in history, and very predictably that he just needs more time, of course, to make things even better. In other words, it was classic political hypocrisy, right? He was perched on both sides of the fence, telling us that the economy was already amazing, but at the same time begging for re-election because, of course, with 2 more years, things could be even better. Very political, and I think nothing we haven't heard before.
I mean, one of the things that Biden has been saying repeatedly, and I think here he's just trying to almost appeal to people's sense of forgetfulness. When he was asked about inflation, for example, he said in effect, "Oh, it was terrible when I got here." Even though inflation in reality, if I'm not mistaken, 1.4%? Now, admittedly,
Correct.
Inflation went up to something like 8 or 9%. It's now dropped back a couple of points. But the idea that Biden inherited inflation and therefore is not to blame for it makes no sense, does it?
Absolutely no sense. And if we go back, we remember that, inflation was surging prior to the invasion in Ukraine. And then, of course, Biden for a long time was blaming the invasion in Ukraine. So he's looking for any scapegoat. Now, of course, he inherited the inflationary problem. Anyone who can remember the last couple of years understands that that's not the case. I also think if we're going to touch on inflation, headline inflation's come down a little bit, but only in 2 areas, right? It's come down in energy prices, which surged significantly and now reverting to the mean, and used cars, sorry. Outside of those 2 things, everything else is really increasing. So core inflation is looking very sticky, which tells us that the Fed really haven't got a handle on this inflationary problem. And we're seeing it with prices surging again in January. So there's a lot of work to be done on the inflationary piece, I think.
Now, Biden seems on a little firmer ground when he points to the most recent GDP number, say 6.5%. Hey, the economy seems to be picking up steam. Number 2, he points to low unemployment. And unemployment does seem to be relatively low. But talk about those 2 numbers, the GDP number and unemployment. What do you make of those?
Look, 6.5% GDP is significant, right? The average GDP since World War II is about 3.13%. But being the Biden administration, we got to look at these numbers a little bit more closely. So GDP is the total output of goods and services, and it has grown under Biden from 19.2 to 20.45 trillion. However, what we have to understand, by the way, that's a 6.5% increase, right? What we have to understand, these numbers are not adjusted for inflation. So what was headline inflation last year? Exactly 6.5%. So look, I know the president is a politician, not a mathematician, so I can unpack this. We produced exactly the same amount. It just costs more, net gain being 0. Look, clearly, and we mentioned before, people are feeling this. This is our reality. The economy right now is on a hamster wheel. It is moving absolutely nowhere, and it's doing so at a fast pace. So those GDP numbers, very misleading. Unemployment, is interesting, right? We've seen a huge explosion in jobs, right? But the question is, which jobs, right? We've been seeing the tech sector has been, huge layoffs, 80,000 high-paying tech jobs laid off, right? Now, according to ADP, the two hottest fields of job growth in 2022, healthcare, leisure, and hospitality. So what it looks like is we're losing higher paying jobs and getting, less desirable jobs in exchange. But we've got to understand the reality for workers. Workers' pay up 4.2%, while the cost of living officially is up 6.5%. Real inflation, much, much higher than that. So the reality is people's paychecks are not going as far. They're losing purchasing power. Now, quickly to take a broader look, 80% of CEOs are predicting near-term recession, tightening their belts right now. Corporate infrastructure investments at the lowest level since the worst of the pandemic. In other words, job numbers are good for now, but we may not see such a rosy picture as the realities of recession start to kick in.
What do you think, Philip? I mean, it seems to me that when you're looking at a recession, you're by and large also looking at a stock market that is going to be at the best rocky, and perhaps even be looking at some potentially severe pullbacks. It's not unusual for the stock market to drop 15, 20, even 30%, in some cases, of course, up to 50%. And so it seems to me that what is called for here, and I'd like to find out if you agree with this, is to remain cautiously invested on the one hand, but to make sure that you've got assets that are hedged against a declining stock market. And so this to me is the case for gold. I look at it as protecting my downside. Would you agree with that assessment or that rationale? Or is there a different way that you think about it?
I think it's absolutely spot on. And I like the fact that you use the word hedge. I think it's very important. As much as we think we know where the economy is heading, nobody has a crystal ball. So to maintain exposure across the board, I think makes sense. However, in climates like this, precious metals become particularly important, given the nature of our problems. And we've mentioned a few, right? We have a lot of air coming out of a stock market bubble that has been built over the last 13, 14 years. And of course, as a consequence of a lot of that policy, we're dealing with inflation at 40-year highs. These are a big problem for anyone holding stocks and bonds, right? Stock market crashes, by definition, bring stock values down. Bonds are struggling today because rates of interest are being outdone by rates of inflation. So bonds that used to be a really effective hedge, not doing what they used to. And that's where gold and silver come in. The same problems that have a negative effect on stocks and bonds actually drive gold and silver up. When stocks crash, safe haven demand goes up, gold and silver can go up. Don't forget, they both doubled in value within the 18 months of the 2008 crash. Same goes with inflation, right? Everyone knows what inflation is. It's when things become more expensive. The technical definition of it, though, is the rising cost of commodities and services over time. Gold and silver, being commodities, of course, increase with the cost of living. So they're contrarian to stocks and bonds, therefore work very well as a hedge in a climate where downside in stocks and bonds is the big concern.
Very interesting. Phillip Patrick, thank you very much for joining me. I really appreciate it. Once again, the website, guys, birchgold.com.